Alright, let's begin. Winter, in the Middle Ages, was not a charming inconvenience or a background aesthetic. It was a long negotiation with cold, hunger, darkness, and the quiet understanding that the season itself was not particularly interested in your survival. There were no thermostats, no weather apps, and no reassuring sense that spring was scheduled to arrive on time. People adapted anyway. Not heroically, not elegantly, mostly by layering wool, lowering expectations, and inventing routines that made misery feel normal. This story isn't about great victories over winter. It's about persistence, about small habits that added up to staying alive, one numb morning at a time. Before we drift any further into the cold, if you enjoy these long, quiet history stories, feel free to subscribe. And if you're listening late at night, you can leave a comment with your city and the time you're listening from. It's always quietly interesting to see where everyone is and how late it's gotten. Chapter 1. When winter moved in and refused to leave. Get yourself comfortable now. However that looks for you tonight. Maybe a blanket. Maybe adjusting a pillow that never quite sits right. Let the room stay dim. Let the day finish unwinding in its own time. There's nowhere to be for a while. Medieval winter is already here, and it's not in a hurry either. In the Middle Ages, winter didn't arrive with a sense of occasion. There was no first snow day excitement. No collective agreement that this would be cozy. It simply settled in, gradually at first, and then all at once, like a guest who decided they lived there now. By late autumn, the air inside homes began to feel the same as the air outside, just with a roof. Walls slowed the wind. They didn't stop the cold. Most people lived in buildings that were, by modern standards, extremely optimistic about insulation. Wooden frames, packed earth floors, gaps you could feel with your hands. Even stone houses, which sound solid and reassuring, held onto damp like it was a hobby. Once cold set into stone, it stayed. It lingered. It crept up through feet and legs and made itself known in joints that would complain for the rest of a person's life. Staying alive through winter was not about warmth in the way we think of it. It was about not freezing. There's a difference. Warmth was a luxury. Avoiding death was the goal. Everything else was a bonus. Clothing did most of the work. Not stylish clothing. Not fitted clothing. Just layers. Wool on more wool. Linen underneath, if you were lucky enough to have it, absorbing sweat so it didn't chill you later. Outer garments were rarely washed during winter. Not because people enjoyed being dirty, but because wet clothes in cold air were dangerous. Dampness was the enemy. Smell was tolerated. Hypothermia was not. People slept in their clothes, or very close to them. Nighttime was the most dangerous part of the day. Fires were often allowed to die down before sleep, partly to conserve fuel and partly to avoid waking up dead from smoke. Beds were not warm places. They were collections of fabric, straw, and shared body heat. Families slept together, not out of affection, necessarily, but efficiency. Heat was precious. You didn't waste it by sleeping alone unless you had the space and fuel to afford that choice. Blankets were heavy, intentionally so. Weight kept them from shifting and letting cold air sneak in. Feather beds existed, but they were expensive and not particularly hygienic. Most people slept on sacks stuffed with straw or chaff. The straw flattened over time, becoming less bed and more suggestion of comfort. It was replaced when it could be, which was not often. Waking up in winter was an exercise in reluctance. Breath visible in the air. Water frozen in bowls. Boots stiff with yesterday's moisture. Getting dressed meant embracing cold deliberately, layer by layer, until your own body heat slowly fought back. This took time. There was no rushing it. Rushing just made you clumsy and miserable. Food was the second line of defense. Winter diets were repetitive and dull, but designed to last. Bread hardened into something closer to a tool than a meal. Pottage, a slow stew of whatever was available, simmered when fuel allowed. Salted meat appeared sparingly. Fresh vegetables were rare. Apples stored poorly but were eaten anyway. Cabbages endured. Turnips waited patiently in cellars. Calories mattered more than flavor. Fat was valuable. Not in theory. In practice. Butter, lard, dripping from cooked meat. These were survival tools. A body with reserves endured cold better. Thinness was not admired in winter. It was concerning. Fuel, though, was always the quiet anxiety in the background. Firewood took time to gather, dry, and store. Peat was cut and stacked. Dung was dried into fuel cakes. Anything that burned was considered. Fires were kept small and functional. One hearth for cooking. One room where everyone gathered. Heat did not spread. It hovered, low and local, and faded quickly when the fire died. People adapted their days to the light, or the lack of it. Winter days were short, gray, and unambitious. Work happened when it could. Spinning, mending, tool repair. Quiet jobs that could be done indoors without wasting fuel on extra light. Candles existed, but they were used carefully. Tallow smoked and smelled. Beeswax was expensive. Darkness was accepted early. And while that quietly carried on, bodies adjusted too. Movement slowed. Expectations narrowed. Winter was not the time for big plans. It was the time for endurance. For not getting sick. For not slipping on ice and injuring yourself in a world without antibiotics or physical therapy. Illness was common. Colds lingered. Coughs became permanent companions. People understood, vaguely, that cold weakened the body. They didn't know why, exactly, but experience had taught them caution. Staying dry mattered. Staying fed mattered. Rest, when possible, mattered. Communities leaned inward during winter. Travel decreased. Roads turned to mud or ice. News arrived late, if at all. Villages became smaller worlds. Everyone you needed was already there, or they weren't coming until spring. Winter was endured collectively. Shared labor, shared heat, shared silence. People told stories. Quiet ones. Familiar ones. The kind that didn't require much attention. Repetition was comforting. Predictability was soothing. There was no romance in this. No poetic struggle against nature. Just routine. Just getting through the day without making things worse. And once you accepted that, once winter became a long, unchanging backdrop instead of an enemy to be defeated, survival became more manageable. Not easy, just manageable. Chapter 2. Work that existed only because it was cold. By the time winter had fully settled in, most outdoor labor had slowed to a crawl. Fields rested, whether people wanted them to or not. The soil was too hard, the light too weak, and the risks too high. But idleness was never the goal. Winter simply rearranged work rather than removing it. Inside homes, hands stayed busy almost constantly. Not out of ambition, out of necessity. Still hands grew cold faster, and cold hands made mistakes. So people worked slowly, deliberately, keeping circulation going through repetition. Spinning was one of the most common winter tasks. Wool that had been cleaned and prepared earlier in the year now became thread, one careful twist at a time. It required little space, little light, and no fire beyond what was already burning for warmth. A spindle could rest in the hand while conversation drifted quietly around it. The work was hypnotic. Draw, twist, fin. And again, enough to keep fingers moving without demanding much thought. Knitting and weaving followed. Socks, caps, mittens, items that wore out quickly and needed constant replacement. Winter destroyed clothing. Moisture, salt from sweat, rough use. A pair of wool hose might last a season if cared for, or half a season if it wasn't. Repairs were constant. Nothing was thrown away if it could be patched. Fabric was too valuable for that. Cobbling was another winter occupation. Shoes cracked in cold weather. Leather stiffened, then split. Soles wore thin faster on frozen ground. Someone in the household, or the village, usually knew how to mend them. New shoes were rare. Repairs were the rule. Even poor repairs were better than none. Bare feet in winter were not an option. Tool maintenance filled the darker hours. Wooden handles loosened as they dried. Metal rusted in damp air. Knives dulled. Axes chipped. Winter was when tools were brought back into tolerable condition, not perfect condition. Perfect wasn't necessary. Usable was enough. Some jobs existed almost entirely because of winter. Ice cutting, for instance. In colder regions, blocks of ice were cut from frozen rivers and lakes and stored in insulated pits, packed with straw. This ice lasted well into warmer months and was used to preserve food or treat injuries. It was dangerous work. Cold water, heavy blocks, slippery surfaces. But it was done anyway, because ice was valuable and winter was the only time to get it. Salt work continued year-round in some areas, but winter slowed it. Evaporation was less cooperative. Still, salt was essential. Meat preserved without it spoiled quickly. Fish rotted. Salt workers endured cold winds and damp conditions because stopping wasn't an option. Hunger waited patiently for mistakes. In towns, winter brought its own quiet industries. Tallow chandlers rendered animal fat into candles, filling streets with a smell that everyone recognized and no one enjoyed. Tanners continued their unpleasant work when they could, though freezing temperatures made soaking hides difficult. The smell lingered regardless of season. And while that quietly carried on, people adjusted their daily rhythms to conserve energy. Mornings began later. Evenings ended earlier. Not because anyone wanted extra sleep, but because moving in the dark wasted fuel and increased risk. A twisted ankle could be fatal. A broken leg almost certainly was. Children were folded into winter work early. Not heavy labor, but useful tasks. Carding wool. Fetching water when it wasn't frozen solid. Watching younger siblings near the hearth. Winter childhood was slow and constrained. Play existed, but quietly. Loud games burned energy and drew reprimands. Heating a space was rarely the goal. Heating people was. Everyone clustered near the fire. Chairs were arranged with their backs to walls to reduce drafts. Benches were shared. Personal space shrank. Privacy became a memory. Disputes happened more often simply because people were too close for too long. Sleeping arrangements shifted as well. Extra bodies meant extra warmth. Servants slept near employers not for status, but practicality. Animals were sometimes brought indoors, or at least into attached spaces, their body heat contributing slightly to the overall survival strategy. It smelled. Everyone accepted this. Winter also changed how people thought about time. Without clear markers like planting or harvest, days blurred together. Saints' days provided structure. Church bells marked hours when daylight couldn't be trusted. Time became softer, less exact. People measured it by meals, by firewood used, by how many candles remained. Illness hovered constantly. Respiratory infections spread easily in close quarters. Smoke irritated lungs. Damp air settled into bones. People coughed. A lot. Remedies were simple. Wondrix. Honey when available. Herbal infusions whose effectiveness varied wildly. Mostly people waited and hoped. Death, when it came, was handled quietly. Burials were harder when the ground froze. Graves took longer to dig. Sometimes bodies were stored temporarily, kept cold by necessity, until the soil softened enough to receive them. This was not dramatic. It was routine. Winter demanded patience above all else. Patience with discomfort, with repetition, with people. The season rewarded those who did not panic, who did not rush, who conserved rather than conquered. And so life contracted inward. Fewer ambitions. Smaller days. Survival not as an achievement, but as a continuation. As the weeks dragged on, people counted stores. Grain bins. Salt barrels. Firewood stacks. Everything diminished slowly, visibly. Each log burned was one less standing between now and spring. Each loaf eaten was a calculation, not a pleasure. Chapter 3. The long middle, when winter stopped feeling temporary. By the time winter reached its center, people stopped talking about when it had started. That information no longer mattered. What mattered was how much was left. And no one ever quite knew the answer to that. This was the part of winter that tested routines. The early adjustments had been made. The novelty of snow, if there ever was such a thing, had worn thin. Now there was just cold as a constant condition, like low light or gravity. It was everywhere and not worth remarking on anymore. Food stores were still present, but visibly reduced. Barrels sat lighter. Sacks slumped lower. Grain bins showed their bottoms. Every meal carried a quiet awareness of subtraction. Nothing dramatic. Just arithmetic. Eat this now, and it won't be there later. Meals became smaller without much discussion. Portions adjusted naturally, the way people do when they know complaining won't change anything. Thick stews thinned slightly. Bread slices narrowed. Fat was stretched. Bones were boiled again and then again until they offered nothing but the idea of nourishment. People learned to ignore hunger in a specific way. Not deny it, just place it somewhere else in the mind. Hunger became background noise, like the wind outside or the ache in stiff fingers. Present, acknowledged, but not given center stage. Cold behaved similarly. It stopped being something you reacted to and became something you managed around. Tasks were chosen carefully. Movements were economical. No one wasted. Steps if they didn't have to. Standing still was avoided. Sitting too long meant stiffness. Balance was important. Not too much motion. Not too little. Inside homes, air quality declined steadily. Fires burned low and smoky. Ventilation was minimal because fresh air was cold air. Eyes stung. Lungs complained. But warmth, however imperfect, mattered more. Smoke was familiar. People lived with it the way they lived with darkness. Clothing showed the strain of constant use. Sleeves shone with wear. Knees thinned. Elbows frayed. Repairs piled up faster than they could be completed. Patches layered over older patches, creating garments that were more history than fabric. Still they worked. Mostly. Feet suffered the most. Cold ground pulled heat relentlessly downward. Socks were doubled when possible. Insoles were improvised from straw or cloth. Shoes were kept near the fire at night, though never too close. Burned footwear was useless. Slightly warm footwear was priceless. Water was another quiet challenge. Wells froze. Buckets iced over. Streams slowed. Fetching water took longer and carried more risk. Slips happened. Fingers numbed quickly. Spilled water meant starting over. No one enjoyed this task, but it couldn't be skipped. Bathing was rare. Not because cleanliness was unimportant, but because water and heat were both scarce. Instead, people wiped down with cloths when possible. Faces, hands, the most exposed parts. Full immersion waited for warmer months. Everyone smelled faintly of smoke and wool and themselves. It was unremarkable. Sleep patterns shifted again during this period. Nights felt endless. People slept in segments, waking briefly between them. Fires were checked. Children repositioned under blankets. Someone always seemed to be awake, staring into low embers, listening to the wind test the structure of the building. Dreams were affected by cold. People dreamed of warmth, of summer fields, of bread that was soft and abundant. Waking was unpleasant. Dreams were better places than reality for a while. And while that quietly carried on, sickness became harder to avoid. Bodies already weakened by reduced diets struggled to recover from even minor illnesses. Coughs lingered for weeks. Fevers came and went. People rested when they could, which was not often. Work didn't stop because someone felt unwell. It just slowed slightly. Care was basic but attentive. Warmth was the primary treatment. Extra blankets. Better positioning near the fire. Hot liquids if available. Honey herbs, whatever could be spared. There was no expectation of miracles. Just support. Children were watched closely. They lost heat faster. They didn't always understand why stillness was dangerous. Parents hovered without appearing to. Extra layers were added quietly. Beds were shared more deliberately. The elderly were treated with a particular kind of respect in winter. Not sentimental respect. Practical respect. They moved slower. They needed help sooner. Losing an elder meant losing experience, memory, and labor that could not easily be replaced. Communities noticed when someone failed to come out of their house one morning. Religion played a steady role during this time. Churches were cold but familiar. Services were attended when possible. Not always out of devotion, but out of habit and structure. Rituals marked time when nature refused to do so clearly. Candles flickered. Breath fogged the air. Sermons were endured patiently. Festivals that fell in winter were quieter than their calendar descriptions suggest. Feasts were modest. Celebrations were restrained. Joy existed, but it was careful. No one wanted to waste resources pretending winter wasn't happening. Entertainment was subdued. Storytelling leaned toward the familiar. Long, rambling tales that everyone already knew. The telling mattered more than the content. Music was simple. Instruments stayed close to the fire to avoid cracking. Singing was gentle, not loud. Energy was conserved even in joy. Arguments happened more often too. Close quarters and limited patience created friction. Disputes over firewood use, food portions, space. Most were minor. Some lingered. Winter had a way of amplifying small irritations. People learned, slowly, to let many things go. There was no room for grudges that burned energy. Animals required constant attention. Livestock that survived into winter were valuable. They were fed from stored fodder, another resource carefully measured. Sick animals were a serious concern. Losing one could shift a household's survival odds noticeably. Stables were checked often. Bedding was refreshed when possible. Body heat mattered here too. Rodents became more noticeable during this period. Mice and rats sought warmth and food just like people did. Traps were set. Cats were appreciated. Grain was guarded carefully. Losses were accepted as inevitable, but minimized where possible. Weather patterns during deep winter were unpredictable. Thaws came unexpectedly, turning paths to mud. Refreezes followed, creating treacherous surfaces. Roofs leaked. Thatched coverings sagged under snow, then dripped water into living spaces. Buckets appeared indoors, catching slow leaks with resigned patience. Travel during this time was rare and deliberate. Only necessary journeys were attempted. Messages waited. Trade slowed further. People who left villages did so knowing delays were likely. Inns were cold. Roads were uncertain. Winter travel was an exercise in caution. Time continued to stretch. Days felt both long and indistinct. Without major changes, memory blurred. People remembered winter not as a sequence of events, but as a single extended sensation. Cold, dimness, endurance. And yet, signs of survival appeared quietly. Someone recovered from an illness. A birth occurred, inconveniently timed but celebrated nonetheless. A store of grain lasted longer than expected. Small successes mattered more now. Hope, when it existed, was practical, not abstract. Hope meant enough food until spring. Enough fuel until the worst passed. Enough strength to continue doing what had already been done for months. As winter moved past its midpoint, people began watching for changes. Not expecting them yet, just watching. Light lingered slightly longer. Not enough to matter, but enough to notice. The sun climbed a fraction higher. Shadows shifted. Chapter 4. The lean weeks, when survival became arithmetic. Late winter was not the coldest part of the year. People knew this even then. The sharpest frosts often came earlier, but late winter was when cold felt personal. By now, everyone was tired of it. More importantly, everyone was running low. This was the season of counting. Counting loaves. Counting logs. Counting days, even though no one knew exactly how many remained before something changed. Spring was a concept, not a promise. Food stores reached their most delicate stage. What remained was what had survived months of careful use. Mistakes made earlier in the winter now became visible. A barrel that had leaked unnoticed. Grain that had molded slightly and had to be discarded. Meat that had been eaten too generously during darker months. No one spoke much about these things. Regret didn't refill a pantry. Meals simplified further, sometimes dramatically. A pot might contain little more than water thickened with grain and flavored faintly by something that used to be meat. Salt was still used, but sparingly. Every pinch was intentional. People learned to stretch food creatively, though creativity here meant patience rather than invention. Bread was soaked and recooked to make it feel like more. Leftovers were never wasted. Even the idea of waste felt offensive in this part of the season. Hunger changed behavior subtly. People became quieter. Movements slowed further. Conversations drifted toward practical topics. Who had extra turnips? Whose grain might last? Which households were struggling more visibly? Help was offered when possible, but resources were limited. Charity existed, but it was cautious. Cold compounded hunger. A body without enough fuel struggled to stay warm. Shivering became more common. Extra layers were added even indoors. People sat closer to the fire, even if that meant enduring more smoke. Comfort was no longer the priority. Firewood was watched carefully. Stacks had diminished noticeably. Logs that once seemed plentiful now looked alarmingly small. Families adjusted fire use again, letting it burn lower, extinguishing it earlier in the evening, rekindling it later in the morning. Embers were preserved with care. Starting a new fire from scratch wasted energy and fuel. Some households resorted to burning less ideal materials. Green wood that smoked heavily. Broken furniture that had outlived its usefulness. Tools and objects were weighed mentally. Would this still be needed later, or was warmth now more important? Clothing reached its most exhausted state. By this point, many garments had been worn daily for months. Repairs could no longer keep up. Thread ran out. Patches thinned. Still, people wore what they had. A hole was uncomfortable but survivable. No clothing at all was not. Shoes were particularly vulnerable. Soles wore through. Leather cracked completely. Some people wrapped their feet in cloth or straw inside damaged shoes to extend their life. Others simply endured cold feet and hoped circulation was enough. Frostbite was not fully understood, but its consequences were well known. Water remained a daily challenge. Ice thickened again after brief thaws. Carrying water strained already tired bodies. Spills felt catastrophic. Dropping a bucket wasn't just clumsy. It was a loss of time and energy that couldn't be easily replaced. Sleep became lighter during this period. Hunger and cold kept people from resting deeply. Waking during the night was common. Fires were checked obsessively. Children shifted and murmured. Adults lay still, conserving warmth, listening to the sounds of the buildings settling in cold air. Illness during late winter was particularly dangerous. Bodies had fewer reserves to draw on. Recovery slowed. A sickness that might have been survivable earlier now carried more risk. Caregivers did what they could, but options were limited. Warmth, rest, and hope were the main treatments. Deaths, when they occurred, were handled with restrained urgency. The ground was still hard. Burial was difficult. Communities worked together when needed because no one wanted bodies lingering longer than necessary. Rituals were shortened, not out of disrespect, but necessity. Emotionally, this period tested patience more than fear. People were not panicking. Panic wasted energy. Instead, there was a quiet heaviness, a sense that everyone was carrying something invisible but shared. Complaints were rare. They didn't help. Children sensed the strain even if they didn't understand it fully. They were fed first when possible. Adults went without quietly. Hunger among children was noticed quickly and addressed if there was any way to do so. A community that let its children starve risked not surviving at all. Animals were monitored closely. Feed was low. Decisions were made about which animals could be spared and which were essential for future survival. These choices were practical, not sentimental. Losing an animal was serious, but keeping one alive through winter was sometimes impossible. Rodent activity peaked during this time. Desperation drove them further indoors. Traps were checked frequently. Grain stores were guarded almost obsessively. Cats were treated generously if there was anything extra to give. They earned it. Social tensions rose slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. Small disagreements lingered longer. People had less patience for nonsense. But outright conflict was still avoided. Winter was not the time to make enemies. Religion and ritual continued to provide structure. Prayers focused on endurance rather than deliverance. People asked not for miracles, but for strength. For enough. Always for enough. Despite everything, routines persisted. Work continued, though at a slower pace. Spinning, mending, watching fires, fetching water, caring for the sick. The repetition itself became stabilizing. It reminded people that life was still moving, however slowly. And then, gradually, almost insultingly gradually, something shifted. Light lingered just a bit longer in the evenings. Not enough to celebrate. Enough to notice without mentioning. Shadows softened. The sun's position changed subtly on walls and floors. No one trusted this at first. Winter had misled them before. False springs were common. Thaws came and went. Snow melted and returned. Hope was kept deliberately small. Chapter 5. The slow thaw, when winter loosened without apologizing. The end of winter did not arrive cleanly. It never did. There was no clear moment when people could say it was over and mean it. Instead, the season began to behave differently, like someone preparing to leave without announcing it. Snow melted during the day and returned at night. Paths turned to mud, then hardened again by morning. Boots grew heavier. Floors stayed damp. The cold didn't disappear so much as lose its confidence. It still lingered, but it no longer dominated every decision. People noticed the light first. Not consciously at first. Just a sense that tasks were easier to finish before dark. That there was time for one more small thing in the evening. Candles lasted longer. Fires were lit slightly later. These changes were subtle enough to be ignored, which made them comforting. Food was still scarce. Spring did not bring immediate abundance. In fact, early spring could be worse than late winter. Stores were low, and nothing new had grown yet. People knew this and adjusted expectations accordingly. The relief of changing seasons was emotional before it was practical. Hunger eased only slightly, but morale shifted more noticeably. The knowledge that something else was coming mattered. Even if that something was mud and work and uncertainty, it was different from endless cold. People began preparing tools again. Not repairing, but readying. Plows were inspected. Handles tightened. Metal edges sharpened a little more carefully than winter maintenance required. There was purpose in these actions. A direction. Work now pointed forward instead of merely maintaining the present. Clothing was adjusted. Heavy outer layers were still worn, but lighter garments began to reappear during the day. These were often threadbare, saved carefully from earlier seasons. Seeing them again felt strange, like greeting someone you hadn't expected to survive the winter either. Homes changed slowly. Doors were opened more often. Air moved through rooms. Smoke lingered less. Floors began to dry. Buckets catching roof drips were emptied and removed. Small repairs were attempted, though not always completed. Energy was returning unevenly. Animals sensed the change before people trusted it. Livestock grew restless. They shifted in stalls, eager for movement. Feed remained limited, but the promise of grazing eased concerns slightly. Sick animals were reassessed. Some recovered. Some didn't. Losses were counted carefully and without ceremony. Travel resumed cautiously. Short journeys first. Visits between nearby households. News trickled in. Not important news, usually. Just confirmation that other people had survived too. That mattered more than events elsewhere. Markets did not immediately return to full activity, but small exchanges happened. A bit of grain here, a tool there. Barter resumed its quiet rhythm. Prices remained high. No one expected generosity from scarcity. Health improved gradually. Coughs softened. Fevers broke. People stood a little straighter. Sleep deepened slightly as nights shortened. Bodies, given even a modest increase in food and light, responded with cautious gratitude. Children became louder. Not suddenly, but noticeably. Energy returned to their movements. They spent more time outside, even when conditions were unpleasant. Mud was tolerated. Cold was less discouraging. Adults watched them with a mix of relief and concern. Spring injuries were common. Winter had taught caution. Spring tempted recklessness. Religious observances shifted tone as well. Still restrained, but more hopeful. Prayers acknowledged survival explicitly now. Thanks were given without much flourish. Gratitude was practical, not emotional. People began cleaning in earnest. Not the deep cleaning of later centuries, but functional cleaning. Removing accumulated debris. Clearing spaces that had been closed off. Preparing rooms for different uses again. The house itself seemed to wake slowly. Despite all this, winter never fully released its grip. Late frosts destroyed early attempts at planting. Cold rains soaked fields. People grumbled quietly, then adapted. They always did. Complaining did not move the seasons. This transitional period was dangerous in its own way. Overconfidence led to mistakes. People dressed too lightly, traveled too far, assumed conditions had improved more than they had. Experience tempered enthusiasm. Elders cautioned patience. They were usually right. Still, the direction was unmistakable. Each day carried slightly more possibility than the last. Not dramatically more. Just enough. Stores were nearly empty now, but that mattered less because the cycle was restarting. Seeds were counted. Land was assessed. The future, vague and demanding, returned to attention. Winter survival shifted into spring endurance. Different challenges. Similar mindset. Persistence remained the skill that mattered most. And as the season continued to retreat, people did something very specific and very human. Chapter 6. Remembering winter before it arrived again. Once the worst had passed, people didn't talk about winter much. Not directly. There was no long analysis of what had gone wrong or right. No formal reckoning. Instead, memory settled into daily habits where it could do the most good. Someone stacked firewood a little higher than usual. Someone salted meat a bit more thoroughly. Someone insisted on repairing a roof in summer even though it was probably fine. These were not framed as lessons learned. They were instincts shaped by discomfort. Spring work moved forward steadily, but without celebration. Fields were plowed when they could be. Seeds were planted when the soil allowed. Frost risk was respected. People had been fooled before. Winter's retreat was never trusted completely. Food changed slowly. Greens appeared first. Not filling, but welcome. They broke the monotony of preserved flavors. Diets expanded carefully. Overindulgence was avoided. Bodies that had endured scarcity needed time to adjust. Too much too quickly caused illness. Moderation lingered as a habit even when it was no longer strictly necessary. Tools that had been patched through winter were repaired properly now, if materials allowed. Handles were replaced. Blades were reforged. Broken things were fixed not just to function, but to last. There was urgency in this work, but not panic. Summer was coming, but so was the next winter. Everyone knew that. Clothing received similar attention. Heavy winter garments were cleaned as best as possible and stored carefully. Moths were a known threat. So was damp. Chests were lined. Herbs were tucked in among folds. These clothes represented survival. Losing them would mean facing the next cold season unprepared. Shoes were repaired thoroughly if possible. Soles replaced. Stitching reinforced. New footwear was made for those who could afford it. Feet had suffered enough. No one wanted a repeat performance. Homes were inspected with fresh eyes. Cracks that had let in drafts were patched. Doors were adjusted. Roofs were rethatched or repaired. Smoke damage was scrubbed where it interfered with breathing. Improvements were incremental. Perfection was not expected. Improvement was enough. People also remembered winter socially. Quietly, carefully. They remembered who had helped and who had withdrawn. Who had shared and who had hoarded. These memories were not always held against anyone. Circumstances varied, but they influenced future trust. Winter revealed character without asking permission. Community bonds were reinforced subtly. Shared labor increased. Mutual aid was discussed indirectly. Someone might mention, casually, that helping last winter had made a difference. No speeches. Just acknowledgement. Those who had lost family members carried grief into spring work. There was no pause for mourning. The dead were remembered while the living continued. Grief became another quiet weight carried alongside fatigue and responsibility. Children absorbed winter memories differently. They remembered cold more vividly than scarcity. Frozen fingers, dark mornings, heavy blankets. These impressions shaped their sense of normal. Winter was something to be endured, not questioned. That understanding settled early. Elders spoke slightly more often during the season. Advice was offered with renewed confidence. Their warnings carried fresh relevance. People listened more attentively than they might have months earlier. Experience had been validated again. Summer planning included winter preparation almost immediately. Crops were chosen with storage in mind. Not just yield, but durability. Which grains kept best? Which vegetables stored longest? Which animals provided the most reliable returns? These decisions were practical, not theoretical. Weather was watched closely. Rain patterns mattered. Drought threatened future winters just as much as cold did. People understood the cycle instinctively. One bad season echoed into the next. Religion framed this awareness gently. Not as fear, but as order. Seasons turned. Hardship followed abundance. Abundance followed hardship. Acceptance was encouraged. Not passivity, but balance. Festivals that arrived in warmer months carried a restrained joy. People celebrated, but not extravagantly. Excess was remembered as dangerous. Celebration existed alongside caution. Trade resumed more fully now. Markets grew louder. Goods circulated. But winter had adjusted expectations. People bargained carefully, saved more, planned longer. Stories about the winter began to settle into familiar shapes. Not detailed accounts, but impressions. That was a hard one. Not as bad as the year of. Comparisons emerged. Memory smoothed the edges. Details blurred. Only the lesson remained: prepare. Summer brought its own challenges, of course. Heat, labor, injury. But these were active hardships. They felt different. Winter was passive. It waited. It endured. It pressed down. And because of that, winter held a particular place in memory. Not dramatic, just unavoidable. By late summer, preparations quietly intensified. Extra firewood gathered. Additional grains set aside if possible. Repairs checked again. The cycle turned smoothly, without announcement. People did not dread winter constantly. They did not obsess over it. They simply acknowledged it as part of the shape of life. Like aging, like illness, like death. Not welcome, but expected. Chapter 7. Winter as background noise, not a story anyone told straight. By the time winter returned again, it did so without ceremony. No one marked the exact day it began. There was no announcement, no collective pause. Cold simply reappeared in small ways, and people adjusted without comment. A door was closed more firmly. A cloak stayed on indoors. A fire was lit earlier than usual and allowed to burn a little longer. These actions did not feel like decisions. They felt automatic. Winter had trained people well. This second encounter with winter, after memory had settled and preparations had been made, felt different from the last. Not easier, exactly, but less surprising. The body recognized the signs. The mind followed. Homes filled in again. The outdoor world shrank politely, retreating beyond walls and door frames. Life contracted inward, just as it always did. The difference now was familiarity. The routines returned like old acquaintances. Not welcome ones, but known ones. Food stores were assessed calmly. There was no dramatic inventory, just a sense of how long things might last. Grain bins were checked, meat inspected, root vegetables examined for spoilage. Problems were addressed early when possible. A little mold removed, a soft spot cut away. Nothing wasted. Clothing came out of storage smelling faintly of herbs and smoke. Wool stiff from months of rest softened again with wear. People layered without thinking about it. Muscle memory guided fingers through buckles and ties. The body remembered how to stay warm before the mind engaged. Work shifted indoors again, smoothly this time. Spinning resumed. Mending piles formed. Tools were brought closer to the hearth. Winter workspaces reassembled themselves without instruction. It felt almost efficient, almost organized. Children adjusted quickly. They always did. They learned again where they were allowed to play, where not to run. How close was too close to the fire? These boundaries were enforced gently but firmly. Winter demanded obedience in small things. Sleep patterns shifted back into familiar rhythms. Shared beds, heavier blankets, layered coverings adjusted through the night. Waking briefly to check embers, to listen to the wind, to reposition a child who had kicked free of warmth. None of this felt remarkable. Cold settled into joints again. People noticed it more in the beginning, before acceptance dulled awareness. Fingers stiffened in the mornings. Knees complained. Backs resisted sudden movement. Complaints were brief. There was no audience for them. The weather outside continued on its own schedule. Snow arrived when it felt like it. Ice formed unpredictably. Thaws teased and retreated. People adapted without expecting consistency. Expectations had been lowered permanently. Winter illnesses appeared again, as they always did. Coughs returned. Fevers visited. Remedies were applied with quiet confidence. Rest when possible. Familiar herbs. Familiar hopes. Survival depended more on prevention than cure. Social life condensed again. Visits were shorter. Conversations quieter. People conserved energy socially as well as physically. Silence was not awkward. It was efficient. Religion maintained its steady presence. Services attended when weather allowed. Rituals repeated. Words spoken that everyone already knew. Comfort came from repetition rather than inspiration. Winter became something like background noise. Always present. Rarely the focus of conversation. People talked around it instead of about it. Discussed work, animals, repairs, the future vaguely. Time passed slowly and quickly at the same time. Days dragged. Weeks vanished. Memory compressed everything into a single long impression of dim light and restrained movement. Losses occurred as they always did. Someone didn't recover from an illness. An animal didn't survive the cold. These events were acknowledged briefly and absorbed into the ongoing effort of living. Grief was real, but it did not stop the routine. It couldn't. Winter demanded continuity more than emotion. Feeling too deeply interrupted the necessary flow of tasks. People learned to carry sorrow quietly, like hunger or cold. And while that quietly carried on, something else happened too. Winter lost its sharpness. Not because it became kinder, but because people became better at enduring it. Each season layered experience onto experience. Small efficiencies accumulated. Better storage. Better habits. Better instincts. This did not make winter safe. It made it predictable. And predictability, in a world with very little certainty, was valuable. People understood now that survival was not about winning against winter. It was about not escalating the conflict. Don't fight the cold directly. Work around it. Don't challenge hunger. Manage it. Don't rush time. Let it pass. This mindset shaped everything. Architecture, clothing, diet, social behavior. Winter was woven into culture so deeply that it became invisible. Stories about winter, when they were told at all, were understated. It was a cold one. Food ran low. We managed. The details were unimportant. The outcome mattered. Children grew up assuming this was how life worked. Seasons tightened and loosened. Effort increased and eased. Nothing stayed comfortable for long. Nothing stayed unbearable forever either. This understanding created a particular kind of resilience. Not dramatic resilience. Not heroic endurance. Just steadiness. The ability to continue doing what needed to be done without expecting reward. By the time spring arrived again, months later, it was greeted with mild interest rather than celebration. Relief existed, but it was restrained. People had learned not to trust transitions too much. Winter would return. And because it would return, spring was treated as a working season, not a victory lap. Fields waited. Repairs waited. Preparation resumed almost immediately. In this way, winter shaped the entire year, even when it was absent. It dictated storage. It dictated caution. It dictated the pace of life. People stayed alive during freezing winters not through clever tricks or secret knowledge, but through a quiet acceptance of limitation. They worked within narrow margins. They respected scarcity. They planned for discomfort. They endured by refusing to be surprised. Chapter 8. The small habits that mattered more than strength. By this point, winter no longer felt like a single season. It felt like a condition that faded in and out, leaving behind habits that never fully disappeared. People carried winter with them, even in warmer months, in the form of small decisions that didn't look important on their own. These habits were rarely discussed. They weren't taught formally. They were absorbed by watching, by repetition, by quiet correction. Someone closed a door quickly instead of letting it hang open. Someone hung damp clothing farther from the hearth than instinct suggested. Someone saved a scrap of fat that could have been eaten immediately and set it aside instead. None of these actions were dramatic. All of them mattered. One of the most important habits was pacing. Medieval people learned early that effort had to be distributed carefully. Bursts of hard work were followed by rest, not because rest was pleasant, but because exhaustion was dangerous. A tired body lost heat faster. A tired mind made mistakes. Winter punished overexertion more reliably than laziness. People learned how to sit. This sounds trivial, but it wasn't. Sitting too close to the fire risked burns and smoke irritation. Sitting too far away meant cold settling into muscles. Chairs and benches were positioned with precision learned over years. Even posture mattered. Curling inward conserved heat. Stretching out did not. Eating slowly was another habit shaped by winter. Not for enjoyment, but efficiency. Hot food cooled quickly. Eating too fast wasted warmth. Eating too slowly let the meal go cold. People found a rhythm that balanced nourishment and temperature, often without realizing they were doing it. The way people handled water changed too. Water was never taken lightly. Buckets were covered. Containers were stored carefully. Spills were treated as serious inconveniences rather than accidents. Children were taught this early. Carelessness with water in winter was remembered sharply. Foot care became almost ceremonial. Shoes were checked daily. Socks aired near the fire but not over it. Wetness was addressed immediately. People knew that cold feet could ruin an entire day, and enough ruined days could lead to worse outcomes. Preventing discomfort prevented decline. Breathing habits even shifted. Smoke-filled rooms taught people to breathe shallowly without thinking about it. Fresh air was appreciated but rationed. Windows were opened briefly, then closed. Air was exchanged, not invited in. Conversation adapted as well. Talking required energy. So did listening. People spoke less, and when they did, it was often about practical matters. Gossip still existed, but it softened. Winter made drama feel unnecessary. There was no surplus energy for it. Movement inside the home followed patterns. Paths formed between the fire, the table, the door. These paths were kept clear. Tripping hazards were removed not for neatness, but survival. Falling in winter was not a minor inconvenience. It was a serious threat. Children learned where not to step, where not to run, where not to touch. These lessons were enforced calmly. Raised voices wasted warmth. Calm correction was more efficient. Even emotions were managed differently. People learned not to dwell too deeply on discomfort, not to amplify it through attention. This wasn't denial. It was prioritization. Feeling cold did not warm you. Feeling hungry did not feed you. Acknowledgement followed by adjustment was the preferred response. This emotional economy extended to fear. Winter was dangerous, but fear was unhelpful if it didn't lead to action. People worried quietly, then did what they could. Excess worry was treated as indulgent. Memory played a role here too. People remembered winters in fragments. Not whole seasons, but moments. The week the firewood almost ran out. The day the water froze solid. The night the roof leaked onto the bed. These memories guided future behavior more effectively than any abstract lesson. Winter habits also shaped social etiquette. Visiting someone in winter meant not staying too long. It meant contributing something if possible. Fuel, food, labor. Being a burden in winter damaged reputations quickly. Being helpful strengthened them permanently. Hospitality existed, but it was practical. A place near the fire. A bowl of something warm. Not extravagance. Enough. People learned when to speak and when to stay quiet. Silence conserved warmth and energy. Long pauses in conversation were normal. Comfortable even. No one rushed to fill them. Even humor changed. Jokes became drier. Observations flatter. Laughter quieter. Big emotions felt out of place when survival depended on steadiness. These habits accumulated over lifetimes. A person who had survived many winters carried an invisible manual inside them. They didn't think of themselves as resilient. They simply knew what to do. And this knowledge was shared constantly, though rarely explicitly. A hand moved someone's cup closer to the fire. A blanket was adjusted without comment. A warning was given casually. Not there. Too close. Later. Winter sharpened awareness of limits. Of the body's needs. Of the environment's indifference. People learned not to ask more of the season than it could give. And because of that, survival became less about strength and more about consistency. About doing small, correct things repeatedly. Strong people failed winters just as easily as weak ones if they ignored these habits. Careful people endured longer. This understanding filtered into every part of life. Work was approached with moderation. Storage with respect. Time with patience. Winter did not reward effort alone. It rewarded alignment. Doing things in ways that matched conditions rather than resisted them. By the time someone reached old age, if they did, they had internalized this completely. Winter no longer frightened them. It irritated them. It inconvenienced them. But it did not confuse them. They had learned the rules. Chapter 9. Communities that winter quietly shaped. Winter did not just teach individuals small habits. It quietly structured the rhythm of entire communities. Survival depended on collective understanding, though it rarely required explicit planning. People learned through observation, repetition, and subtle enforcement of unspoken rules. Villages contracted inward in winter. Streets became paths of necessity, cleared just enough to move between houses or to the well. Travel beyond the village was minimal. Not forbidden, but unappealing. Roads were treacherous. Mud, ice, and hidden obstacles made even short journeys risky. Community life slowed. Meetings were fewer, discussions shorter. Decisions were made carefully, because mistakes were more expensive in winter. A misjudged exchange could mean burned firewood or wasted food. Even small errors mattered. People noticed, and habits adjusted quietly. Neighbors shared resources, though generosity was always measured. Firewood might be lent, but only in quantities that didn't threaten the lender's survival. Meals were occasionally shared, but nothing extravagant. Charity existed, but it was practical. Those who accepted it were expected to do what they could in return, even if it was just mending tools or tending animals. Work was coordinated naturally. Certain households specialized in tasks that became essential in winter. Some people were skilled in mending shoes. Others knew the safest way to cut ice from rivers. A few tended to animals most efficiently. Everyone contributed in ways that aligned with their abilities. This minimized wasted effort and kept the community functioning. Children were part of this system. They performed small tasks appropriate to their size and strength. Carrying water, gathering kindling, watching younger siblings near fires. Even play was structured around survival, often indoors, quiet, and designed not to expend too much energy. Stories and news circulated slowly. Winter made long journeys difficult, so information traveled at the pace of snow and ice. Letters were rare. Gossip moved through physical presence, careful and deliberate. People valued reliability over speed. Accuracy mattered more than entertainment. Health was a collective concern. If someone fell ill, they were observed by neighbors. Care was pragmatic. Shared knowledge about what treatments worked, which herbs helped, or how to keep a child warm enough spread quietly. This wasn't charity. It was communal self-preservation. The survival of one household influenced the survival of many. Animals required collective management too. Grazing lands were limited. Winter feed had to be rationed carefully. Disputes arose occasionally, but usually resolved pragmatically. The cost of conflict was higher than the cost of compromise. Religion reinforced this social cohesion. Services and rituals reminded people of shared experience. Prayers emphasized endurance, community, and the passage of time. Even casual observers absorbed these lessons. Ritual in winter was as much about keeping everyone alert and aligned as it was about spiritual comfort. Noise levels in winter reflected this communal awareness. Loud activities disturbed warmth, drew attention, or risked accidents. Conversations were quieter. Children's play was subdued. Music, when it existed, was soft. The rhythm of life adjusted to the constraints imposed by the season. Small errors were noted, but rarely punished formally. Instead, habits enforced themselves. Someone who repeatedly wasted fuel would be watched silently. Tools that were mismanaged would be corrected quietly. Repetition was the mechanism of social learning. Celebrations, when they occurred, were muted. Festivals acknowledged survival, not joy. A shared meal or a simple ceremony reinforced bonds without depleting resources. Happiness was quiet and understated. Exuberance was dangerous because it wasted warmth and energy. In this way, winter molded a society that functioned efficiently under scarcity and cold. Habits, social norms, and structures all aligned to maximize survival. Life became a series of small agreements, often unspoken, designed to maintain enough warmth, enough food, and enough energy to keep going. People understood, collectively, that survival was not heroic. It was patient, consistent, quiet, and while that quietly carried on, children grew up observing all of it. They learned the rhythm of winter before they even had a name for it. They learned the limits of fire, the fragility of stores, the value of small kindnesses. They learned that a community survived not because of a few strong leaders, but because everyone understood their role, however minor it seemed. Chapter 10. Structures, Storage, and the Silent Work of Survival. By the Middle Ages, people had learned that survival in winter wasn't just about personal habits or community cooperation. The built environment itself had to play a role. Houses, barns, storage pits, and everyday tools were all shaped to endure long months of cold, darkness, and scarcity. Winter demanded design without fanfare, and people delivered it quietly. Houses were often small, not out of necessity alone, but because smaller spaces were easier to heat. Rooms were multifunctional. Kitchens doubled as living spaces. Sleeping areas were often combined. Everyone knew that clustering together meant warmth. Privacy was a luxury that winter could not afford. Walls were thick where possible, often made of stone or timber. Gaps were plugged with mud, clay, or straw. Windows were few and small, allowing light but minimizing drafts. Glass was rare and expensive, so shutters, oiled cloths, or wooden panels were used instead. These measures kept the worst of the cold outside, though they never made interiors truly comfortable. Roofs were steep to shed snow, but the thatch or tiles had to be maintained carefully. Even a small leak could drip continuously onto bedding or food storage. Buckets, pans, or simple boards collected these drips, and nobody complained. Water in the wrong place meant a new chore, and winter left no time for frustration. Storage was critical. Root vegetables, grains, and preserved foods were kept in locations designed to minimize spoilage. Underground pits or cellars were common, insulated with straw or earth. These spaces were damp enough to prevent cracking but dry enough to keep mold at bay. Barrels and sacks were rotated carefully. Oldest items were used first. New arrivals went to the back. This system was simple, but it had to be maintained with meticulous attention to detail. Meat was preserved with salt, smoke, or drying. Smokehouses were often located downwind, partly to prevent the smell from filling homes and partly because smoke slowed decay. Animals were butchered with careful planning. No more than was necessary because every portion had to last. Waste was unthinkable. Even tools were designed with winter survival in mind. Handles were wrapped or reinforced to prevent cracking in dry, cold air. Metal edges were hardened for longevity. Tools were kept near the fire only when absolutely necessary. Too much heat could warp them. Too little made them brittle when finally needed. Efficiency dictated placement and maintenance. Cooking implements followed the same logic. Pots and pans were reused constantly. Fires were built for multiple purposes: warmth, light, and cooking simultaneously. Fuel was rationed carefully. A poorly timed fire was more than inconvenient. It could ruin an entire day's schedule. Furniture was practical rather than comfortable. Benches, stools, and tables were solid, simple, and easy to move closer to the hearth. Beds were often raised on platforms to avoid cold floors. Extra bedding layers were stowed nearby. Everything had a function, and that function was tied directly to survival. Even the layout of villages reflected winter's priorities. Narrow streets minimized wind exposure. Buildings were grouped for mutual warmth and protection. Paths between homes were cleared first, then public spaces, if at all. The order of attention was always practical, always survival-oriented. Water storage was another key feature. Wells could freeze. Buckets and cisterns were sometimes insulated or covered. Melted snow was collected in small amounts for drinking or cooking. Everyone understood that water mismanaged in winter meant delays, discomfort, or illness. Attention to these details was second nature. Clothing storage was also strategic. Garments were rotated and repaired constantly. Winter clothing was heavy, layered, and rarely laundered extensively because washing was labor-intensive and drying was difficult. Items were kept near warmth, but not so close that they absorbed too much smoke or risked fire. Shoes were aired carefully, sometimes stuffed with straw to retain shape and insulation. Animals, too, were incorporated into structures. Stables were often attached to living spaces to provide extra warmth. Hay and straw were layered for insulation. Livestock was watched with a mixture of pragmatism and vigilance. Their survival meant future survival. Every animal had a designated space, and that space was maintained without complaint. All of these structures and systems were subtle. They did not announce themselves. They were not heroic. They were quiet, practical, and continuous. They required little thought once habits were ingrained, but their absence was immediately felt. A leak, a forgotten bundle of hay, a mismanaged barrel could cascade into significant problems. And while this quietly carried on, people adjusted incrementally over decades. Each generation refined the structures. Each learned from the last. There were no sudden leaps, only slow improvements that accumulated year after year. A wall patched better here, a storage pit insulated more thoroughly there, a roof slope adjusted slightly to prevent snow accumulation. Each change small, but collectively vital. Winter survival, then, was not just an individual or communal affair. It was architectural, material, embedded into the physical world. The homes, tools, storage systems, and village layouts all worked together, silently supporting the people who relied on them. The interplay between habit, community, and structure created a system that was greater than its parts. None of it was glamorous. None of it was dramatic. Yet without it, survival was far less likely. Chapter 11. The Quiet Economy of Survival. Winter demanded attention in ways that were often invisible. Money, trade, or fame meant very little when snow covered the roads and ice coated the wells. What mattered was the careful management of resources, energy, and attention, the quiet economy that determined whether a household would endure the season intact. Food was the centerpiece of this economy. Every portion of grain, every scrap of preserved meat, every root vegetable was counted, rotated, and rationed. Meals were measured more by sustainability than satisfaction. People learned to eat not for fullness, but for endurance. Eating too much risked running out sooner. Eating too little risked weakness. The balance was subtle and learned slowly. Fuel followed the same principle. Firewood was stacked and used with precision. One log burned too quickly could leave a room cold for hours. Too little fire, and the household risked frostbite or illness. Coal, when available, was saved for specific purposes: cooking, heating water, or warming those most vulnerable. Attention dictated allocation more than desire. Water was another critical commodity. Wells froze, streams slowed, and snow had to be melted carefully. Spilled water represented wasted energy and time. Children were taught early to handle buckets cautiously. Every drop mattered. Even small mistakes could cascade into discomfort or illness. Time itself became a resource. Tasks were planned around daylight and warmth. Chores were prioritized for efficiency. Moving too much energy out of one task could compromise another. People structured their days as a sequence of survival steps. tending animals, repairing shelters, preparing meals, managing fires. Every moment was observed, and missteps were quickly corrected. Labor was divided according to capability. Children, adults, and the elderly all had roles suited to their strength and endurance. Overextending anyone risked health and efficiency. The quiet economy of winter valued consistency over heroism. A person who worked steadily was more valuable than one who labored in bursts and collapsed. Trade and barter existed even in winter, though at reduced scale. Villagers exchanged surplus goods carefully. One extra loaf of bread, a handful of salt, or a portion of firewood could shift a household from risk to relative security. Trust mattered immensely. A neighbor who failed to deliver or hoard too much risked social consequences, subtle but effective. Attention itself was a currency. Watching the fire, monitoring the food stores, checking the health of children and animals, all required vigilance. Mistakes were expensive. Negligence could cost warmth, nourishment, or life. People became finely attuned to small details: the level of water in a bucket, the color of a potato, the sound of wind through the roof. These observations were invisible but crucial. Energy management extended to the body as well. Movement was deliberate. Standing still too long risked cold, moving too much wasted calories. Sleep was carefully scheduled around warmth and duty. Overexertion could compromise health. Rest was not indulgence, it was strategy. Clothing, tools, and bedding were part of this economy too. Repairs were performed immediately to prevent further loss. Shoes were patched rather than replaced. Blankets were layered with care. Items were rotated to maximize their lifespan. Every choice reflected the value of maintaining functionality under harsh conditions. Even social interaction was economical. Visits were brief. Conversations were purposeful. Arguments were avoided when possible, because conflict consumed energy and resources. Humor existed, but subtly, in ways that required little exertion. The household, the family, the village, all depended on conserving effort while maintaining function. Religion, rituals, and customs reinforced this quiet economy. Services reminded people of seasonal cycles, communal obligations, and endurance. Prayers were practical, for warmth, for survival, for enough food to last. Festivals occurred cautiously, often modest in scale, to avoid unnecessary depletion of resources. Animals, too, were carefully managed. Feeding schedules, bedding rotation, and health monitoring were performed with precision. Livestock represented both sustenance and labor, and their survival was integral to human survival. Mistakes could ripple outward, affecting the household's stability. This economy created patterns of behavior that became habitual. People internalized efficiency, conservation, and attention to small details. Actions that might seem trivial in summer, closing a door firmly, rotating barrels of grain, checking embers, took on critical importance in winter. By late winter, the quiet economy reached its peak. Food was lowest. Fuel was scarce. Energy reserves were minimal. Every choice mattered. Small successes, a properly managed fire, an unspoiled root vegetable, a dry pair of socks, carried disproportionate significance. And while that quietly carried on, people learned one overarching lesson. Survival was cumulative. It depended not on a single heroic effort, but on the consistent, careful, low-profile application of knowledge, habit, and attention. Winter did not reward panic or drama. It rewarded preparation, subtlety, and foresight. Those who understood the economy of endurance and participated fully within it were the ones who reached spring intact. Chapter 12. The Ritual of Daily Life in Cold Months. Winter shaped more than structures or community. It shaped time itself. Days slowed, nights stretched, and routines became a kind of rhythm that everyone followed almost without thought. Personal schedules were no longer merely convenient. They were survival tools. Morning began quietly, often before light broke fully across the village. People rose carefully, mindful of stiffness and lingering cold. Moving too quickly wasted energy and exposed the body to discomfort. Every movement was measured. Shoes were donned deliberately, cloaks layered with care. Those who slept near the fire had to shift without disturbing embers. Those farther away had to coax themselves into motion, mindful of joints chilled overnight. Breakfast, when it existed, was modest and deliberate. Leftovers from the previous day were reheated, rotated, and shared among the household. Meals were eaten slowly, partly to conserve warmth, partly to make rations last. No one lingered unnecessarily. Food was fuel. Wasting time or energy at this stage risked deficits later in the day. Tasks were sequenced around the cold, the light, and the energy required. Water was carried early, while frost was still manageable. Firewood was stacked and added to the hearth according to a practice schedule. Animals were fed carefully, their needs anticipated and met in a deliberate order. One misstep could force repeated trips outdoors, wasting both calories and warmth. Domestic chores occupied much of the day, and each was performed in a rhythm dictated by necessity. Spinning, sewing, mending, cooking, and cleaning were all repeated daily with minor variations. These acts, though mundane, became almost ceremonial. They provided structure, a sense of control, and most importantly, survival. The repetition reinforced skill and efficiency. Children were integrated into these routines early. They carried water, gathered kindling, tended small animals, and assisted in cooking. Play was subdued, indoors, and often functional, helping fold blankets, repair clothing, or sort grain. Through this, they learned both the mechanics of survival and the discipline it required. Midday brought minimal relaxation, more of a pause than leisure. People rested close to warmth, conserving energy for the afternoon and evening. Meals were again frugal and functional. Energy management dictated every action. Overexertion in one period could compromise the ability to perform essential tasks later. Afternoon work included repairs and preparation for night. Roofs were inspected, windows adjusted. Food was portioned carefully for evening use. Fires were tended, tools checked. Nothing was left to chance. Small errors could accumulate into discomfort or loss. Evening was both rest and vigilance. People gathered near the hearth, but not for conversation alone. Fires were monitored, food kept safe from spoilage or rodents, and children watched carefully. This time was structured around observation. Nothing was left unattended. Nighttime routines included layered bedding, careful positioning near warmth, and minimal movement. Sleep was strategic. Bodies were arranged to conserve heat, protect children, and maintain alertness in case of emergency. Every element of the household was considered: fire placement, ventilation, proximity to food and water, ease of access to essential tools. Personal hygiene was performed pragmatically. Bathing was rare in the depths of winter. Clothing was rotated, aired, and repaired as needed. Cleanliness was balanced against the practicalities of warmth, fuel, and time. Even grooming became a small but significant ritual, maintaining order and comfort where possible. Throughout all of this, repetition was key. Each action, repeated day after day, strengthened habit. Memory reinforced efficiency. Awareness sharpened. Mistakes became rare, because life in winter demanded precision. Social interactions were woven into these routines but restrained. Visits were brief. Conversations were functional or supportive. Noise and excess energy were minimized. Humor existed quietly as a small relief from monotony, but it never disrupted essential tasks. Rituals also had psychological value. Lighting the hearth at a particular time, checking each child's blanket, rotating stored food, or reinforcing insulation all became a mental framework. These small acts provided continuity, reduced uncertainty, and allowed people to navigate months of cold with a sense of order. Chapter 13. The Subtle Innovations of Cold Months. Winter rarely inspired grand invention. There were no brilliant machines or dramatic breakthroughs. Instead, people relied on small, quiet adaptations, subtle innovations that addressed everyday inconveniences without calling attention to themselves. These solutions were often invisible to outsiders, embedded seamlessly into life, and required patience more than genius. One of the most common adaptations involved heating. Open hearths dominated, but people experimented quietly with improving efficiency. Clay or stone partitions redirected smoke and warmth. Pots of water were placed near fires to humidify air and provide heat simultaneously. Metal hooks, carefully positioned, allowed multiple pots to cook slowly without requiring extra fuel. Each adjustment was minor, but together they made hours near the fire more productive and slightly more comfortable. Food storage inspired its own innovations. Barrels were lined with leaves or straw to reduce spoilage. Underground pits were reinforced with timber to prevent collapse. Cold frames or rudimentary insulated boxes kept early greens and tender roots from freezing. People rotated supplies carefully, stacking older items above newer ones so that nothing went unnoticed. These methods required attention, not invention. They worked quietly, without fanfare. Clothing adaptations were subtle as well. Wool layers were stitched with extra care. Straps and ties were adjusted to trap heat without restricting movement. Socks were doubled or stuffed with straw. Gloves were sometimes lined with moss or cloth scraps. Footwear was reinforced at the sole with extra layers of leather or cloth. None of these solutions was new in concept, but the exact combination of materials, techniques, and placement was refined year after year. Lighting demanded attention too. Candles were trimmed meticulously to burn longer. Tallow was reserved for essential use. Mirrors and polished metal surfaces reflected light into dark corners. People learned to angle lamps strategically, maximizing both illumination and warmth. Small efforts, multiplied across days and households, added up to meaningful improvements in daily life. Water management also inspired minor creativity. Buckets were insulated with straw. Ice was chipped carefully to minimize effort. Snow was melted incrementally to preserve heat and fuel. People discovered simple tricks, covering containers to prevent freezing, placing vessels near hearths without tipping them into the fire, and collecting rain or condensation when possible. These adaptations saved energy, and in winter, energy was as valuable as food. Sleeping arrangements evolved gradually as well. Beds were raised to avoid cold floors. Straw mattresses were layered with blankets or animal hides. Multiple small beds were grouped to conserve warmth. Pillows were stuffed with dry materials that insulated rather than just provided comfort. Even the position of sleepers in a room was considered, close to heat sources, yet not too close to smoke. Animals, integral to winter survival, received attention through innovation. Simple feeding devices conserved hay. Straw was arranged for insulation in stalls. Cattle and smaller livestock were sometimes rotated to share warmth from body heat in confined spaces. Even minor adjustments reduced loss and improved comfort. These adaptations were rarely documented. Knowledge passed orally, through demonstration and observation. Children learned by doing, noticing, and mimicking. Habits reinforced techniques. Small improvements survived because they worked, not because they were celebrated. Many innovations were accidental. A leak in a roof led to the creation of a catch basin. A spilled barrel prompted better stacking techniques. Trial and error, guided by necessity, created solutions that became standard practice without anyone thinking of them as extraordinary. The quietness of these innovations is notable. They were not designed to impress. They were meant to make life survivable with minimal effort. Attention to detail, patience, and repetition were valued far more than creativity in the modern sense. Even humor and comfort were adjusted through innovation. A cushion of straw by the hearth, a simple curtain to block drafts, or a low stool for a child by the fire, all subtle, practical, and repeated every winter. These small interventions shaped experience more effectively than any dramatic invention could. By the end of winter, these tiny improvements accumulated into a kind of mastery. People knew how to manage heat, light, food, and comfort with minimal resources. Each household developed its own combination of techniques, slightly different from neighbors, refined over years of experience. Chapter 14: The Quiet Shaping of Mind and Mood. Winter did more than challenge the body. It shaped the mind, subtly and persistently, over weeks and months. The cold, the darkness, and the monotony pressed against thought in ways people learned to accommodate without realizing it. Psychology itself became a part of survival. Moods shifted slowly. Light was scarce and days were short. People became accustomed to a subdued emotional baseline. Excitement was rare. Joy was measured. Even humor was restrained. Laughter existed, but it was quiet and fleeting, more like a release than a celebration. Strong emotions were dangerous. They wasted energy and attention, and in winter, both were precious. Monotony became a teacher. Repetition of daily tasks, feeding animals, mending clothing, tending fires, preparing meals, was not boring. It was a framework for stability. Minds learned to focus on what was essential. Distractions were recognized and minimized. Surplus attention was dangerous because it could lead to mistakes. Observation sharpened. People noticed small changes in weather, in smoke, in animal behavior, in the state of food stores. These observations were often unconscious at first, but over time, the brain learned to prioritize them. Winter trained attention toward survival. Sleep patterns adapted as well. People learned when to rise, when to rest, when to sleep heavily and when lightly. Nighttime vigilance became habitual. Even dreams were often shaped by the rhythms of survival, movement through cold spaces, preparation, planning. Mental rehearsal of mundane tasks was common, quietly reinforcing skill and memory. Social perception was also affected. Winter made people more attuned to the needs and behaviors of others. A neighbor's fire left unattended signaled mismanagement. A child's shivering hand demanded action. Communities depended on awareness, subtle cues, and small interventions. Emotional calibration became a social tool. Solitude, too, was absorbed into mental life. With less travel, fewer gatherings, and extended time indoors, people became accustomed to long periods of quiet. Thought became internalized. Reflection deepened, but slowly, without drama. Planning and evaluation occurred continually but unobtrusively. Conversely, fear, anxiety, or impatience had to be managed carefully. Panicking in winter was costly. Cold, hunger, and fatigue magnified emotional responses, making mistakes more likely. People learned to suppress sudden surges of worry, keeping emotion aligned with practical action. Calm attention was valued more than bravery or enthusiasm. Even memory itself was structured by winter. People remembered cold, scarcity, and hardship more vividly than warmth or abundance. These recollections were functional, shaping decisions for the next season. A forgotten bundle of firewood, a spoiled root, a brief period of overexertion. These became lessons stored carefully in mental archives. Children internalized these effects naturally. They learned restraint, observation, and patience before they even had words to describe them. Play was tempered, curiosity directed carefully, risk assessed instinctively. Emotional maturity advanced slowly, guided by necessity rather than formal instruction. Humans became highly attuned to rhythm and routine. Tasks, sleep, meals, and social interactions all followed patterns designed to conserve energy, maintain warmth, and reduce risk. Predictable structures created comfort in the absence of pleasure. Even storytelling and conversation reflected this mental shaping. Tales were understated, observations brief. Drama was rare. Communication was efficient, conveying necessary information without surplus energy expenditure. Humor was dry, subtle, and contained. Emotions were acknowledged but moderated. By the middle of winter, these psychological adaptations were second nature. People moved, spoke, and acted with a calm efficiency that outsiders might mistake for dullness or passivity. In reality, it was skill refined by months of cold, darkness, and constrained resources. And while that quietly carried on, people learned to measure time not by hours or minutes but by practical cycles: feeding, tending, mending, resting. Life was structured to align with environmental rhythms, and mental energy followed suit. This quiet shaping of mind and mood was as important as firewood or preserved grain. It ensured that focus remained sharp, attention was sustained, and survival strategies were executed consistently. Chapter 15: Layering, Bedding, and the Tactile Armor of Winter. Physical comfort in winter was never accidental. People learned to treat clothing and bedding as tools of survival, carefully calibrated to manage cold, moisture, and energy loss. These choices were deliberate, practiced, and reinforced year after year. Winter shaped textiles as much as it shaped behavior. Clothing was layered systematically. Undergarments provided a base, trapping warmth and wicking moisture from the body. Wool or linen tunics added insulation. Outer garments, heavier and sometimes water-resistant, shielded against drafts and damp. Straps, belts, and ties were adjusted precisely to optimize warmth without restricting movement. People didn't think of these layers as fashion, they were armor. Hats, hoods, and head coverings were essential. Heat escapes quickly from the head. Everyone understood this, from the youngest child to the oldest elder. Hoods were lined, hats padded, scarves wrapped strategically. Each accessory served a function, and each was positioned according to experience rather than instruction. Gloves and mittens were carefully managed. Wool, leather, or combinations of materials protected fingers. Some were stuffed with straw or cloth scraps for extra insulation. Hands were checked regularly, and damp gloves were removed or dried immediately. Cold fingers could make work inefficient or dangerous, and the loss of dexterity was always costly. Footwear required special attention. Boots and shoes were reinforced, often lined, and repaired frequently. Soles were layered with cloth or leather to insulate against cold and moisture. Socks were rotated, sometimes layered, and aired carefully near the fire. Wet feet were a serious risk, leading to illness or frostbite, so constant vigilance was applied. Bedding was equally strategic. Straw mattresses were layered with animal hides, blankets, or extra cloth. Beds were positioned to maximize warmth from fires while avoiding smoke and drafts. Sleeping arrangements often clustered people together to share body heat, with children placed near adults for both warmth and supervision. Blankets and coverings were adjusted throughout the night. People learned to anticipate temperature changes as fires dimmed and embers cooled. Small movements could redistribute warmth effectively, reducing exposure to cold. Insulation was not a luxury, it was a necessity, maintained with subtle attention. Even the order of layering mattered. Base layers absorbed moisture. Insulating layers retained heat. Outer layers protected against drafts. Disruption of this sequence could reduce efficiency dramatically. Experience guided placement more than theory. People learned through trial, observation, and repetition. Clothing maintenance became part of daily survival. Small repairs were continuous. Tiers were mended promptly. Stitched seams reinforced. Loose threads removed. Pieces were rotated to extend life and maintain effectiveness. Careless handling could reduce insulation and risk frostbite, making attention a crucial survival skill. Sleeping routines followed similar logic. Preparation began before nightfall. Clothing arranged, bedding layered, fire tended. Sleep was strategic, aligned with energy needs and environmental conditions. Night wakings were managed calmly, checking embers, adjusting blankets, or attending to children without disturbing warmth unnecessarily. Personal layering extended into practical habits beyond clothing. People positioned themselves relative to heat sources carefully. Moving too close to the fire could dry fabrics excessively or increase smoke inhalation. Too far, and energy was wasted shivering. Even minor shifts in posture or position contributed to thermal regulation. Children internalized these practices early. They learned the importance of layering, careful movement, and self-monitoring. These skills became instinctive. Mistakes were corrected quietly through demonstration and gentle supervision. By adolescence, most had mastered the tactile management of warmth. Animals, too, were considered in this system. Stalls were layered with straw and hides. Horses, cows, and smaller livestock were sheltered, their bodies insulated against drafts and damp floors. Human and animal needs intertwined. Keeping livestock warm conserved both food and energy. All of this combined to form a tactile armor. It was not glamorous or novel. It was functional, reliable, and repeatable. It allowed people to preserve energy, maintain mobility, and survive prolonged exposure to cold without dramatic effort. Chapter 16. managing the hearth and indoor spaces. In medieval winter, the hearth was far more than a source of warmth. It was the heart of the household, both literally and figuratively. Its management required constant attention, subtle skill, and a deep understanding of fire, fuel, and space. People who mastered the hearth endured winter more easily, and the household around them functioned more smoothly. The fire itself was tended carefully. Fuel was added gradually in measured amounts. Too much wood at once could smother flames or create smoke that irritated eyes and lungs. Too little left the room cold and bodies stiffening. People learned, often through trial, how to pace the feeding of a fire to maintain steady heat for hours. Smoke management was another subtle skill. Chimneys existed in some houses, but not universally. Many relied on open hearths, vents, or strategic placement of walls and flues. Smoke was directed where it would do the least harm but still circulate enough to avoid suffocating those near the fire. Small adjustments, a shifted pot, a repositioned board, could make a significant difference over hours of use. The hearth dictated spatial arrangements indoors. Beds, work areas, and cooking spaces were positioned relative to the fire. Proximity balanced warmth and safety. People knew which corners were consistently cold and which were too smoky. Movement within the room followed predictable paths to minimize exposure to drafts and maximize heat absorption. Cooking and heating occurred simultaneously. Water was boiled not only for meals but to humidify dry air and provide additional warmth. Pots were hung strategically to capture heat efficiently. Multiple processes were often combined, melting snow for drinking water while stewing vegetables, or drying herbs while warming meat. Energy was conserved by layering tasks, each action serving more than one purpose. Nighttime required additional hearth management. Embers were preserved through careful layering of logs and coals, ensuring that warmth could be maintained through the night without constant supervision. People learned to arrange ashes and embers to radiate heat evenly. A poorly managed fire at night could mean hours of shivering and disrupted sleep. Hearths also served as storage for items needing gentle warmth. Food could be kept slightly above freezing, candles or tallow could be soft enough for use, and clothes could dry slowly overnight. People learned how to take advantage of residual heat, using it efficiently for multiple purposes. Even seating around the hearth followed unspoken rules. Adults closest to the fire absorbed the most heat, while children and the elderly were positioned to maximize their shared warmth. Tasks requiring both hands or focus were performed near the optimal thermal zone, reducing energy expenditure. Movement and posture were continuously adjusted to maintain efficiency. Smoke, light, and heat influenced behavior as well. Prolonged exposure forced people to stagger time spent near the hearth. Some tasks were done in cooler corners to prevent discomfort or overexposure. People developed a mental map of indoor microclimates, navigating them with practiced attention.